Hello and welcome to my video on photosynthesis and cell respiration. These two topics are pretty intense, pretty detailed, but I'm going to go into an overview of them. So here we go. What I really want you to know is what's really down below, the formula down there. 6CO2 plus 6H2O forms, with the help of energy, C6H12O6 plus 6O2. So pause that right now and write that down. That's really important. That is the formula for photosynthesis, and if you flip it around and read it the other way in the opposite direction, that would be the formula for cell respiration. So let's go into photosynthesis in a little more detail. Alright, so here's a nice overview picture of photosynthesis. It starts with a plant, and photosynthesis occurs in the leaves of the plant. So if you were to take this leaf right here and cut it in half and look at the side of it, so here's the leaf, and you cut it like this, cut it in half, and then what you see, that area right there, is right here. That's what this is. So it's called a cross section. And then when you are looking in more detail, you will see chloroplasts, which are right there. And so photosynthesis occurs in the chloroplast. And this diagram right here I'm going to show you on the next slide too in a little more detail. But zooming in on a plant, that's what happens. There's a leaf, and then within the leaf you have the cross section, and then within that cross section there are a lot of chloroplasts. So let's take a deeper look at the chloroplast. Alright, so if you look at the diagram at the top of the chloroplast, you'll notice that there are two membranes. There's an outer membrane and an inner membrane. And photosynthesis happens in two parts of the inside of the chloroplast. One is these little disc things here called thylakoids. Each of these is called a thylakoid. Thylakoids are right there. So each of those is a thylakoid. And if you get a stack of thylakoids, that's called a granum. So this stack right here of thylakoids, that's a granum. Inside each of the thylakoids, the space inside the thylakoid is called a lumen. And so the first part of photosynthesis happens in the lumen, and the second part happens in the space outside the lumen, but still inside the chloroplast, and that is called the stroma. Okay. So the stroma is the space outside of the thylakoids but inside the chloroplast, and that's where the second half of photosynthesis happens. So taking a look now at the bottom picture, you'll see water. So remember, the first part of the formula is 6H2O. So water comes into the plant, it gets into the chloroplast, and it goes into the thylakoids. And once inside the thylakoid, the water gets ripped apart and is basically harvested for the electrons. And so the hydrogen ions and the electrons are used and sent outside into the stroma, and oxygen is produced as a gas. So oxygen is actually a waste product for plants, and it goes back out of the plant, and then we breathe it in. And after the first part of photosynthesis happens, the water has been used up, the electrons and the hydrogen ions are sent into the stroma, and once in the stroma, carbon dioxide comes in, and is used with the electrons and the hydrogen ions to, and a little more water, to make this molecule here called G3P, which is a 3-carbon compound. And what actually happens is this cycle down here, called the Calvin cycle, goes around twice. So this happens 2 times. And after 2 times, you end up with 2 G3P molecules, which then combine together to form glucose. So glucose, remember, is the C6H12O6, And so that's how glucose is made. So the products of photosynthesis: glucose, which is used as energy, and oxygen, which is used as waste. All right, next up we're going to talk about cell respiration. All right, so here's a look at cell respiration, which is basically the opposite of photosynthesis. So here's a cell membrane right here, and glucose, right? You eat the plant, so let's say you eat some spinach leaves that have been doing photosynthesis, and they're making glucose, and it breaks down the spinach leaves, and you get glucose. Glucose comes into the cell, and then when it's in the cytoplasm, in the cytosol, it gets broken down. It gets broken in half into 2 3-carbon molecules, and that process is called glycolysis. And then it will actually rip off one of the carbons from each of the 3-carbon molecules. So you've gone from 1 6-carbon glucose into 2 3-carbons molecules, and then each of those is ripped off, so you get each 2 2-carbon molecules. All right, and in the process you get ATP. That is energy. That's what your cell needs to do work, is ATP. So you're taking glucose, which is food, and you're converting it into ATP, which is energy. If there is oxygen, so if you're breathing, then you've got oxygen in your body. And what's going to happen is the 2-carbon molecule is going to move into the mitochondria. And now that 2-carbon molecule is going to get ripped apart and used for its electrons. And those electrons are going to make a whole lot more ATP. So overall, you can get 2 ATP from this process out here, but in one mitochondria, you can get upwards of 34 to 36 ATP molecules. So mitochondria are pretty important for making a lot of ATP. If there is no oxygen in your body, then you're in trouble. But if let's say you're running a race, and your legs get fatigued really quickly because they're using up ATP faster than can be made, and you're not taking in enough oxygen, you're running a long race, then what can happen is what's called anaerobic respiration, or fermentation in this case, fermentation. So the glucose molecule gets broken down into pyruvate, that's that 3-carbon molecule, and then if there's not enough oxygen there, it's going to ferment, and it's going to make electrons, right? So it's going to make electrons here, rip off the carbons and make electrons, and then cycle it back into glycolysis to make more ATP, all right? In the process, the leftover material is called lactate. So if any of you runners out there get leg cramps and you probably have lactic acid buildup, right? That's where this comes from, lactic acid. It comes from not being able to break down glucose in a way that makes a lot of ATP using oxygen, because your body is using oxygen when you're running. And so your body still needs ATP, but can't make it as efficiently with less oxygen. So lactic acid builds up and then you get leg cramps. The next picture I have is a similar diagram to this, but not with the cell membrane and the mitochondria pictures. It's more words. All right, let's look at that. All right, so here's another picture that shows glucose right here. Glucose goes into the cell, goes through glycolysis, you get ATP, and then the electrons get siphoned off and go into the mitochondria, where they go to the electron transport chain down here, electron carriers, electron transport chain. Within the mitochondria, you have the 2-carbon molecule, acetyl coenzyme A, that then goes into the Krebs cycle and gets ripped apart. more ATP is made there, and then in the electron transport chain, you have a whole lot more ATP made. And in the process, right, water is also made, and you need oxygen in order to do this. This is aerobic respiration. CO2 is broken off. The carbon from the glucose molecule is then combined with oxygen to make CO2, and you breathe that out. Another cool thing, the mitochondria is also double membrane, just like the chloroplast. And actually, both the chloroplast and the mitochondria have their own DNA in them. So even though cells will divide and their DNA in the nucleus, mitochondria will do that separately, as will chloroplasts. All right, the last two slides are nice overview diagrams that I think will help you in understanding how photosynthesis and cell respiration are related. So let's take a look at those. Okay, so if we look at this diagram here and start in the middle on the left, we have CO2 and H2O. So thinking back to our formula, 6CO2 plus 6H2O plus some sunlight, right, will go into the chloroplast. You'll get photosynthesis, and then the process, photosynthesis takes the carbon dioxide and the water and makes oxygen and glucose. And then what happens is we eat the plants, and so we eat the glucose. The glucose goes into our bodies, into the mitochondria, where cell respiration happens. We get ATP, and as a byproduct, we also get heat. And then we make, as waste products, carbon dioxide and water, which then get recycled back into the plant. So we are dependent on plants. Plants are dependent on us. And the next picture that I have is a similar thing, only with just the words. So let's look at that. So this picture, nearly identical, right? Water plus carbon dioxide with the help of sunlight goes into the chloroplast, performs photosynthesis. The photosynthesis then makes glucose and oxygen, which then go down to respiration that happens in the mitochondria, right? And you get heat and ATP, and in the process, the byproducts, water and carbon dioxide, get recycled. ATP, what will happen? ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, and we'll go into a little more detail on that in class later. But ATP, when it gets broken, forms into ADP. So you go from triphosphate, right, 3 phosphates, into a diphosphate, which is 2. So you have ADP plus a phosphate, because one of the phosphates broke off. The NAD plus and the NADP plus, those are molecules that are either in the mitochondria or in the chloroplast that pick up hydrogen ions. And so electron carriers basically is what they are. And so that's what those are. You don't need to know too much detail on those, but that's what they are. They're found in the chloroplast or in the mitochondria, and they carry electrons. All right, I hope that was helpful, and I will see you in class tomorrow.